Appreciate being here in the cyberspace with you guys. Unfortunately, I was hoping to do it in person, but maybe next time. I should just say too, since we're on Zoom, you may hear a little screaming in the background, which is my wife and I just had a baby 2 weeks ago, so we're both tired and struggling to figure out how to do that. So if you guys have any advice on that, that's great as well. Um, but no, but thanks for having me. And yeah, about I guess just a little bit more about my background. So at Newsday, I guess I've been at Newsday about 6 years now, 6 or 7 years. My beat is mostly it's a little bit all over the place, but recently I guess it's been mostly about state politics and voting and voting rights and elections. So a lot of this sort of ethics stuff that that we'll chat about today. And in the last 2 years, it's been a lot about COVID and the COVID response and how to kind of deepen COVID recovery on Long Island and also sort of prepare for the next time something like this happens again, which inshallah it won't, but I think we all know probably something like this will happen again, and we want to be better prepared than we were this time. So I guess one of the last big pieces I worked on right before I was out for a few weeks of paternity leave was an editorial about the tent hospitals that the state built and the Army Corps built on Long Island, which maybe you guys saw, in Stony Brook and Old Westbury, and there are a few others around New York. And I'm not sure if you know, but they were totally not used at all, and it was a big waste of time and effort and money. And so this sort of writing about ways that we can do that better, ways that we can kind of use that effort in a more productive way. Um, and then you guys also very nicely mentioned that the newsletter thing that I and a couple of other writers have been working on, Works Progress, which is one story of fiction, sort of civically engaged fiction a month. And the idea is kind of about sort of ethically engaged fiction as opposed to just stories about yourself. So anyway, if I put the link in the chat, and feel free to check that out. It's free. And my email is also in the chat, so do be in touch if you have story ideas or just questions or concerns for Newsday in general. Happy to be the ombudsman. Um, about political ethics in New York. I've been thinking a lot about this recently for no reason at all. No, this is not a subject that has come up in the news at all recently. No, I mean, obviously, it's been a pretty lousy run in New York politics for the last few years. We have our last three governors, obviously, left in some amount of scandal, the last round of Assembly and Senate leaders, a whole host of people in the legislature who have, and I love this list, a host of people in the legislature who have sexually harassed staffers, extorted money from judicial candidates, entered into a sham marriage for immigration purposes, slashed their girlfriend with gas, been banned from having interns at their office because of affairs, taken thousands and thousands in payments from adult daycare centers, insurance brokerages, liquor stores, real estate developers, nonprofits, and a cooperating witness posing as a carnival promoter. That's just like a tiny list of the misconduct that we've seen in the legislature up in Albany. Obviously, there's plenty of Long Island examples, Dean Skelos aside, including some in the news right now with the Spoda and Walker cases. But I'm also partial to Carl Krueger, who was my childhood state senator in Brooklyn, who lived with his gynecologist companion in the home of the companion's brother, who was also a gynecologist, in a Mill Basin mansion, which was built for the Lucchese crime family boss a couple of blocks away from where I lived. And Carl Krueger pleaded guilty to corruption charges in 2011. So this is all just to say that this is all over the place, right? There is plenty of bad political ethics in New York. I also think it's interesting the way that bad New York political ethics kind of oozes down and provides these pathways, even for good politicians, right? So everyone sort of is affected by this bad politics, this bad political ethics. So, you have Tish James, right, who's the current attorney general who commissioned the big report that basically finished Cuomo, she replaced Eric Schneiderman, who was accused by multiple women of slapping, spitting on, punching, and then intimidating them. And then you have Cuomo's successor, Hochul, right, who got her first break in elected politics when she won a special election for a congressional seat vacated by a guy that Gawker caught creeping on a woman online. I guess she had some local stuff before then, but this was her big break, right? So it's just very common that the way that people move up in New York is by jumping onto the mistakes of their predecessors. Um, Obviously, the big recent example of questionable New York political ethics was Andrew Cuomo and the big report that Tish James put out, which I'm sure most of you guys have either read about or even read part of, if not the whole thing. It's pretty fascinating reading. But there's one like under the radar observation from that report that I've always found really interesting, and I don't think like really got that much attention. It was from an unnamed senior staffer who, was kind of a big deal herself. Like she was a sort of, accomplished political staffer herself. She used to work for the White House. She was very familiar with high stakes, stressful environments. She was no sort of newbie. And the quote that she said in the report was that the way New York's executive chamber was ruled was no way to run a state. And that was the quote. It was no way to run a state. And I think that that's just really indicative of where we are in New York right now. And it's sort of it's a question that's kind of gotten stuck in my mind of why is New York like this? Why are the political ethics of our leaders so bad and so often bad? Um, and by the way, this stuff gets me angry, not really because of or not only because of a philosophical reason that political ethics should be clean, which yes, I think we can all agree, politicians should be ethically clean. But it also, outside of that vacuum, um, bad ethics prevents good people from joining public service, right? It takes spaces for people who want to participate in public service. It affects the way the government is run, right? It affects our housing, our transportation, our policing. It narrows the scope of our civic life. It's not just a philosophical thing. So I think it's really important. And I'll be really curious to hear from you guys why you think, well, first of all, if you agree that New York's political ethics are bad, and second of all, why you think that is. I think there's lots of different rationales, but I'll lay out a few of the things that I've been thinking about on the issue about why this has happened. First of all, I think New York is significantly worse than other states in this regard, like significantly worse. Probably a bunch of you know Jerry Benjamin, who's a pretty esteemed professor. It's at SUNY New Paltz. He's sort of the like political factotum for lots of reporters. People call him all the time for political history. And he says his catchphrase that he tells his students about political ethics in New York is, quote, "Thank God for Illinois." Because basically the point is that Illinois and Louisiana are kind of the only states that even come close to New York in this regard. And that's in some like general academic measures of state ethics that have to do with what protections we have in place, what failures we've had in state ethics. And in those academic measures, New York is basically right at the bottom with Illinois and Louisiana. Illinois, obviously, home to Chicago, another famously corrupt city in political ethics terms. So, we're not doing great. We're not sending our best. We're civically unhealthy. We're, well within the bottom half of other states in voter turnout rates for decades. And things are even worse by other metrics, like we're 47th for per capita registered voters in the 2016 presidential election. It's really bad. It's really bad. There's no reason for this. And crucially, I think the state has been in the middle of a really bad cycle of misconduct and misbehavior recently. In the past decade and a half, 4 of the 9 people elected to one of New York's 4 statewide offices have left office under some sort of shameful cloud. And that doesn't include a state controller who resigned in 2006. And, if that's not the worst run of any state in the union in that time period, it's pretty close, right? It's got to be pretty up the top. So that's one thing. I think that we're pretty bad compared to other states. I also don't think this is new for New York. And that LaGuardia, that Fiorello song, I think is like the perfect introduction to this, right? It's, I mean, even the sort of joke in the introduction that like, oh, we don't have politicians like this anymore. I'm not sure when that was said, but it could be said at any point since LaGuardia, since the musical was premiered, because we have this cycle, we have just this cycle of constant impunity. And I guess the thing that I think about this sort of long-standing cycle, this long-standing like period of misconduct, is that it kind of goes in sort of ups and downs of impunity and accountability, right? So you'll have like moments of really just kind of terrible stuff, like boss tweed sort of stuff, like real sort of clear corruption. And then you'll have like a reformer movement in New York, right? And like people will say, oh, we got to clean this up, we got to change things, and that'll go okay for a few years, and then it'll cycle back, and there'll be like corruption of a new sort. Um, One way to think about this, I was doing some research about the Moreland Act recently, which I don't know how if that rings a bell to people. But the recent example of it is that Andrew Cuomo shut down a Moorland investigation that was like looking at corruption in state politics. But the Moreland Act itself is from 1907, and it came about because after a scandal of legislators that were connected to insurance firms. And so basically, this act gave the state more investigatory powers, and it has been sort of used every once in a while to use those investigatory powers to kind of clean up government in some form. So you can see the cycle with Moreland. There was this real impunity with these insurance firms that were just connected to politicians in a kind of ugly way. And then you have the Moreland Act, which said, okay, we can't do this anymore. We have to reform state government. And it was actually championed by a former governor and future Supreme Court Justice Charles Evan Hughes, who this was like one of his big things of like cleaning up government. But that didn't last very long, right? Because then by I guess a few decades later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was governor at the time, was threatening to use a Moreland Act investigation to look at Jimmy Walker, who was the mayor of New York City. And he was a Tammany regular, a former songwriter who used to just spend his whole time in speakeasies and nightclubs and making payments to magistrates, so very, very corrupt. And again, it was using Moreland to kind of investigate that. So we have these ups and downs, right? And so at the time, FDR did, eventually kind of rein in Jimmy Walker, but that was obviously not the end of corruption in New York. So I think that we just have these cycles, right? And right now I don't know exactly where we are in the cycle, but we've certainly seen a lot of corruption over the last few years, and maybe we're turning on to the part of the accountability cycle. Maybe, I'm not really sure, but we'll see. But we have this cycle that has never been broken over the last 100 years, and that has me wondering why. Like, why is New York like this? Why can't we break this cycle? And I think a big part of that sort of bad political ethics in New York comes from structural problems here in New York, right? There's like these structural issues that have meant that we can't get out of the cycle. So I'm going to run through a few of those. We'll start with like failures of political structure, right? There's like political structures in New York that are preventing good ethics. Clearly, there's not enough ethics oversight in New York government, right? JCOPE, which is the ethics agency, which is supposed to do that kind of oversight, is pretty toothless, doesn't really do it. So that's like a structural thing, but I think it goes even deeper than that in New York. Like, we can talk about the role that money plays in New York politics. Like, that's a structure that has led to a lot of corruption or near corrupt behavior. For example, donors are allowed to give up to $47,000 in a statewide general election, right? All just by themselves. That's over 16 times what they can give in federal races. It's not a great way to run your politics, right? Obviously, someone who gives $50,000 gets a really good listen from a politician, as opposed to someone who gives $5, $10. The big money totally swamps little money in New York, which even the federal system does a better job of kind of diluting. 100 people donated more to candidates in the 2018 state elections than all 137,000 small donors combined. It's a lot, it's not great. Another sort of structural issue that we have in New York is lobbying, which lobbying is, a problem all around the country, but in some ways it's possible that this was even invented in New York State. It's a real old local tradition. The famous story, I don't know if you guys have heard this, but the famous story about where the term lobbying comes from is that Ulysses S. Grant, when he was president, used the term to sort of describe his accostation by citizens in the lobby of the Willard Hotel in DC. But that came like decades after the word was first seen in a newspaper account, which is somewhere around 1817, where a New York newspaper cites a lobby member named William Irving, who was not an actual member of the legislature, but was hanging around the State House and looking for basically action. So it's a long tradition, and what lobbying does is it means that people can hire other people, lobbyists, to influence political debate in a way that kind of takes some of the power away from voters. The other problem, of course, is that there are very few, if any, limits in New York on what lobbyists can do. It's almost non-existent. So that's another structural thing. Then you have the way that New York's budget works, the state budget works. First of all, it's huge. It's like way bigger per capita than other states. Right now, it's like nearly 200 billion, which like dwarfs other states. And so beyond it being big, which attracts a lot of sort of attention from people who want to like squeeze whatever they can out of it, beyond it being big, it's also negotiated and ironed out in this kind of sketchy way, which is sort of ripe for abuse and centralization of power. It's negotiated famously by the governor and the leaders of this assembly and the Senate essentially alone, which Preet Bharara, who's the former U.S. attorney in Manhattan, he once likens to a triumvirate in Roman times. But really, it's like worse than a triumvirate because the governor holds almost all the power here, holds essentially all the cards. And Cuomo himself has kind of muddled the process further in his last few years as governor by putting all of his or most of his policy into the budget. So you're tying like, the things that you're supposed to be doing to improve the lives of citizens to the money, which is not a great idea. And it's negotiated at the end of the night, the end of session, or at this sort of crucial part during the session where there's a deadline, and it doesn't really make for good policy. Where sometimes legislators don't even have time to read the bills. So we can talk a lot, maybe even later, about the way the budget makes for bad governance. But a couple of other structural things, think about the way that marijuana legalization came into effect in other states, right? Often it was raised by citizens who, put it on the ballot, and then people voted on it, yes or no. Pretty good way to do governance, right? It's like pretty grassroots, pretty sort of like up from people, or it could be anyway. That's one way it could work. In New York, that wasn't possible because we don't have that way for citizens pretty much to put an issue on the ballot. It's it has to be done through the legislature, which is why you have those like very kind of wonky, sometimes confusing ballot proposals, on the back of your ballot. So that's something that sort of has held back some reforms in New York. And then beyond the structural issues, I think we have a bad political culture in New York, or we have for a long time. Part of that is the like very, very male nature of New York politics. Up until recently, it was only men up top in New York government. I'm sure you guys have heard lots of stories about the sort of harassment that has led to in Albany. One of the ones that sticks with me is one state assemblywoman from Manhattan who talked about, like her kind of first week on the job when she was a staffer in Albany. She kept noticing people like sticking their heads in her office, like just their heads, and she described it like gophers. She was like, why are these gophers like sticking their heads in? And eventually she found out that she was on a hot or not list, then in Albany, and that all these men were looking in to see like whether she was actually hot. This is a staffer. This is like a woman who is there to do the public business, and she's just doing her job. A couple years later, when she was a chief of staff to a different assemblyman, she's Asian American, and the assemblyman was Asian American as well. A lobbyist came up to her and said, I would pay to do you both. which, wonderful behavior, wonderful behavior. She talked about getting her butt grabbed all the time in meetings or walking around the Capitol. Eventually, she became an assemblywoman. This is Yulie New, who's a assemblywoman, actually running for Senate right now in Manhattan. But that's just one story. I mean, everyone has these stories. It's crazy. It's totally unacceptable behavior. And I think what's interesting is that sometimes these big scandals in New York State politics are tied to, like, the kind of monetary scandals are tied to sexual impropriety in some way. I really like this quote from Alexis Grinnell, who's a political consultant and works on the sexual harassment working group in Albany. She says, sexual harassment or abuse is usually the canary in the coal mine for corruption in Albany. I think that's right, whether it's like using the powers of the office to prevent a harassment victim from going public, or otherwise, using your power in a bad way that kind of relates to sex. This is obviously true long before like the current era in Albany, right? There's like actually a name for this kind of sexual foolery in Albany called the Bear Mountain Compact, which is the idea that anything that happens north of the Bear Mountain won't come back down to politicians' home districts, downstate on Long Island or New York City. Not great, right? It's not. Why should Albany be like the Las Vegas of state capitals? And we talked a lot about harassment with the Cuomo report, and you can debate what constitutes harassment, what exactly happened, what didn't. There's certainly lots of things that are even worse than harassment in New York politics in Albany. Michael Boxley, who was a top aide to Sheldon Silver, who was himself corrupt in his own way. Boxley pled guilty to sexual misconduct involving a 22-year-old legislative staffer. This was in 2003. And this is what he told the judge. On that evening, I had sexual intercourse and there was not consent. Pretty straightforward. I think we know what that is. Yet this guy, Michael Boxley, later found a soft landing for nearly a decade at a top Albany consulting firm. So there's not really accountability for this kind of misbehavior. And harassment itself, and worse, just pushes good people away, right? It pushes women away. It pushes men away who just don't want to deal with this and don't want to be involved in this kind of smut. Other elements of political culture that I think have some effect. There's the split between downstate and upstate. I talked to just in terms of just the location of the Capitol being upstate in Albany. I remember talking to a former Mario aide who once said, like, Albany's great. It's snowy all the time. It's cold. It's boring. There's nothing going on there. It's really far from New York City and and my home districts. Other than that, it's wonderful. And it's I think that's a little bit of the sensation about Albany sometimes, that people really don't want to be there. It's very far from the limelight. It's far from a lot of reporters who are located in New York City, the kind of media center of the universe. It's not to say that reporters don't do a great job in Albany, but the sort of like locus is more downstate. So there's lots of different kind of, I think, cultural differences that sort of add to impunity for politicians. And it seems to me that the bad political culture kind of merges in this synergistic way with bad political structure, like with the budget, right? Like the budget is this bad structure that lets a few people take a lot of control of state government, and it's also hashed out late at night by a couple of people, where staffers are like kind of stuck just waiting and seeing what their bosses are saying. There's a lot of drinking, and it's a time and a place when a lot of women have gotten harassed just getting the budget done, just because that's kind of this sort of like old way of doing it late at night at the last minute. So for all of these structural things, even the cultural things, I think there are potential solutions, right? And people are talking about them these days. For example, you can change the way the budget is done, right? There's no reason that the governor needs to have so much power. That was a court decision that sort of accrued more power to the governor's office in the way the budget is done, but you can change that. That's changeable. You can have real campaign financing in New York, right? Real public campaign financing, so that you sort of attack the power of big money in the state. You can make sure lobbyists release more information about what they're doing and reduce that revolving door between politics and lobbying. You can have sexual harassment training and don't give harassers soft landing pads. You can make it easier to vote in New York. And some of this is being suggested by people in Albany, and and activists, like probably some of yourselves. It's like the people are trying to change the way New York government works. A lot of it, some of the bold-faced names you're seeing are New York City people, like Alessandro Biaggi is loud about a lot of things like this. Yuli New, who I mentioned before, but it's not just an urban thing. There's lots of suburban legislators who are pushing for changes like this too. James Skoufis is one from Westchester, Andrew Gennardis in sort of suburban Brooklyn. And even some of the Long Island legislators as well are sort of pushing for some change. That, however, is if the problem really is structural and cultural. I'm also kind of willing to entertain the possibility that our bad political ethics has something to do with the way that New York, for some reason, pulls or elevates people who are ethically suspect into their politics. I wonder about that. I wonder, like, is it that a sort of brash personality does better here than elsewhere? I'm not sure, but I wonder. Do you need to be kind of flashy and juicy in a certain way to stand out in a big state like New York? Not a sort of, it's a place where there's lots of powerful people, right? There's powerful people in the banking industry, in the media industry. It's, New York State kind of has it all, as opposed to a more like company town, like Los Angeles, right? Which is just in the movie industry. So I wonder if you really need like a big personality to rise above it in New York, and that's why people who are sort of that sort of personality gravitate towards sort of not the best ethics in the world in their politics. I do wonder about that. So that's kind of that's what I've been thinking about with New York political ethics. But I'd be really curious with your take on that, about whether it's structural or whether it is that kind of personality-driven thing, and anything else we've been discussing. All of this. I'm really curious what you guys think.